Hello, everyone, from my virtual home here in Michigan. I'm just amazed at the number of people that I've invited into my home the last few months. Who would have ever guessed that? But here we are today having a virtual Caps and Closure conference. And today we have the privilege to talk to you about the science of sensory and how it relates to the caps and closure industry. But before we get started, many thanks to the Plastics News staff for all they do for the caps and closure industry, especially to Brennan, Joe, Debbie, Colleen, and for all they do for this conference. I think it's a well-run conference and helps to promote the caps and closure industry. So thank you. As I mentioned earlier, we have the privilege here to talk to you about the human sensory science and how that affects the caps and closure industry. And with the Dow team today, we have the guest of Gail Vance Seville from Sensory Spectrum. And then on the Dow team, there's myself, and then Tanya Fry, who runs our Human Sensory Lab, and then Shane Green, who is our analytical senior scientist and SME on sensory science. So with that, a brief history on Dow at the Plastics News Caps and Closure Conference. As you can see from this slide, we've presented multiple times. 2014, we brought you the concept of experts with answers, basics to breakthrough, and collaboration to innovate. And I still see that being used today to innovate caps and closure industry or technology. In 2015, we brought you new resin technology that's still seeing very good success in the aseptic sterilization process applications. And then likewise, in 2016, we talked to you about dispensing applications and how polyethylene plays a key role in those developments. In 2017, we talked to you about our engineering analysis and how we use that as a tool to help accelerate the innovation of closures through mold flow and structural analysis. And then finally, in 2019, we talked to you about regulatory and emerging legislations and how that relates to the caps and closure industry. So again, many thanks to the Plastics News for allowing us to talk. But as I mentioned today, we're going to be talking to you about sensory science. And you can see from this slide here, there's a diverse range of applications that require good sensory science. Because the key element here is that the brand owners do not want to have the package affect the great taste and flavor of their products. And so there's very many applications where, plastic polyethylene is used to make these caps and closures. And so sensory science plays a key role in the innovation of them. And we'd like to talk to you a little bit about that today. From a material supplier's perspective, there's multiple polyethylene processes used to make caps and closure resins. You're going to see words like high pressure process used to make low density polyethylene. And then you'll see terms like solution, slurry, gas phase. Those type of processes are used to make high density polyethylene, medium density polyethylene, and linear low density polyethylene. And each one of these processes has their own process controls and the way that you actually make the polymers. Whether you just use the monomers and comonomers to make the polymer, or if you have to have some transfer media like a slurry or a solution process to carry that. But each process is unique to its own polymer type and the way that it affects sensory performance. And it's your material suppliers that really can help manage the sensory of those polymers and the way that they run their process. And then beyond the manufacturing of the polyethylene process, there's multiple other factors that play into this equation. You'll hear the terms like additives. For instance, you'll hear antioxidants, antistats, UV stabilization. For the most part in the caps and closure industry, what you see there is slips are used a lot. You'll hear the words bifenamide, uracimide. All of those play into the sensory performance of the cap and closure used to package the food or beverage. And then beyond the additives, you'll hear things, the way you convert the actual closure, whether it be injection molding, compression molding, and the time, temperature, pressure that you use to make the closure can all affect the sensory performance. Now there's a new kid on the block called post-consumer recycle, and the whole science around using that technology and incorporating that into the caps and closures. So, and then finally, I think the most important element here or factor is the actual food or beverage that's being packaged, and the requirements that they require in terms of having a good package, and how that package can affect their sensory performance. And there's multiple tests out there used by the brand owners to test not only the caps and closures, but the materials used to make them. And that's where I've got the privilege here with 3 other people on this panel that know far more than I about this. And so I would like to pass that on to Gail Vance Seville, President of Sensory Spectrum, and then followed by Tanya, and then Shane from Dow. So Gail, turning it over to you.
Thanks very much, John. It's my pleasure to be with all of you. I've known Tanya and I have been colleagues for a very long time working through ASTM. And I think my job here today is to tee up the whole idea of sensory from a very large perspective, so that Tanya can then present on how Dow takes this wonderful science and applies it to the caps and closures that you're involved with. So sensory evaluation is not a bunch of people standing around telling you which one they like better. It's actually a scientific discipline in which we measure responses that we evoke from humans about the different properties of foods and other materials as they are perceived through the 5 senses that we learned somewhere around the 4th grade. So think of it more as a science. And I'm actually a chemist by training, and I take this scientific approach very seriously. When you think of the sensory process, you think about a stimulus and people will respond, and you'll say, well, humans are terrible at this. I get all these different responses from people. The thing to remember is that we have different responses, not necessarily because we have different sensory experiences. There's a stimulus, we have a sensory perception and response, and then our brain takes over and starts talking to us about what it might be. The more trained you are and the more experienced you are at this, the better you are at actually having a group of people that will describe a product in very much the same way. There are actually 2 ways that we think about sensory applications, and I'm not going to read you this entire slide, but you need to think about the technical part of sensory that has to do with running really solid tests, and the sensory scientists like Tanya understanding what's going on in the literature, what's going on with respect to scales, what's going on with respect to attributes and statistics, so that from a technical perspective, we're doing absolutely the best science we possibly can. Almost more importantly, and I argue with my academic friends because they think this part isn't as important, and that's the business side. How good are we? How good are the Tanyas and I in communicating to the rest of R&D and manufacturing and quality exactly how I can make a decision, an actionable decision based on these data from sensory, so that we're running a really, really solid business based on the good science of sensory. And we also sometimes walk around with our colleagues at work in R&D and in manufacturing and help them smell and taste things on the spot. Sensory analyst doesn't just conduct a test. If you look at this slide, conducting the test is 5th in the sensory process. What's John or Shane's project objective? What is the test objective, this particular test objective? Let's take a look at the samples and see if we have any anomalies that we have to design a test in a different way. We then design the test. We then conduct the test, analyze, and report the data. And the key element is we don't just dump data on our clients within companies. What we do is we go back to the test objective and the project objective so that what we're reporting is helpful from a business as well as a technical perspective. This was what I call my whining slide. Oh, this is why we can't do it exactly perfectly every time. We never have enough time. We never have enough money. We never have enough samples. And we always don't know exactly how important the decision is. If the decision is small, we can do it faster, a little quicker, maybe even a little dirtier. But if it's an important decision, we need to make sure that we're spending the time and the money and the resources, and we have enough appropriate samples to do the test. So here's my toolbox. I have consumer research, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide, along with product understanding or analytical sensory. And there are, in fact, two major different portions of the sensory toolbox. There's the part that has to do with almost objective measures like instruments, product understanding, discrimination tests, the ever popular triangle test is an example, descriptive tests with our trained expert panels. Those tests tell me about the product, what's going on, how do I describe the product, how do I document the product. The other part of my toolbox is when I go out to consumers and find out how consumers respond. This is the most important, to me, it's the meaning of my life. It's what I do in sensory. What are the two things that you're measuring? You're measuring the product understanding, the sensory properties. And what happens when you go to consumers, which is on the right-hand side of this slide, and they respond talking about liking or product identity or quality? They are filtering the sensory properties in that product through a screen of expectation. And so if you promise them coffee and give them cola, and they love both, they will hate the cola because you told them to expect coffee. So always remember, this happens to be, by the way, why you have product concept misfits. This is exactly the slide that explains why you need to have the sensory properties in the product that actually fits the consumer's screen of expectation. In other words, you have a product in a bottle with a closure, and you have consumers, and together you get the whole picture. You get a full understanding of what are the attributes that are the key drivers of the consumer's perception of clean, or ecologically sound, or tastes terrific. Sensory has applications in several areas. We do a lot of work on basic research, sometimes with universities, but sometimes within companies. Sensory also has a lot of impact with marketing and marketing research. And one of the things I'm going to call attention to is advertising claims. We do a considerable amount of work in support of someone saying that this product is better in a certain way. Most of our work is in research and development. We, as I like to say, I stand in defense of the R&D charter. My job is to tell the directors and VPs of R&D, yep, this product is a good one, so they can move it forward to the marketing side of the business sometime. The interesting thing about the sensory business is that it started with food somewhere, actually it started with beer in about 1933. But then it moved into food in the middle 1900s. Then it went into personal care products, and then finally into paper and fabric and home care products. And so it's a fairly new industry, but it's growing rapidly. So sensory covers everything from the very, very beginning of innovation, and we do a lot of work in design thinking, all the way through the product development process, scale up, production, and a lot of work in both quality control and in QA, even in store pickups and seeing what happens to products in the field. So I'm sure Tanya is going to talk about this, but it's interesting with considering the caps and closures themselves when you're doing sensory, but also what's happening with the other materials. I have a problem sometimes with a cap and closure. if the bottle on which it's sitting is a little bit too squishy, and so I can't unscrew the cap. And so coordinating the cap enclosures with the related packaging is important. What are the enclosed products? Are people only testing with water, or are they testing with the key materials? And what happens over time? A quick reminder, we're going to talk a little bit about the senses very quickly before I close. When you think about vision, the sense of vision, think about what happens in the appearance. And I've just named a few of them here, but the color, the hue, the darkness, and the chroma. And I will tell you that chroma is probably the #1 attribute that changes over time. When things get gray, people don't think they're wholesome, except maybe for mushrooms and eggplant. But it's something to be careful about. In taste and chemical feeling factors that happen on the tongue, what's happening to those over time, and when you use a certain cap enclosure or when you use different packaging materials. This is a big one. Smell, olfaction, contributes to both the aroma as you sniff it and to about 95% of the flavor. And so you need to think about the product, the package, the closure and the caps, and as well as the storage effect. And what's changing? Is the material absorbing some of the flavor of the product or contributing some flavor or aroma? Very important. This is a big one for me. I'm a big fan of texture and touch. There's the mechanical properties, and then there are the tactile properties. And it's very, very important, as far as I'm concerned, that you pay attention to how the product feels. Another packaging example is the people that make diapers and feminine protection products, all of their outside packaging is suede and silent so that it doesn't contribute noise and crispness. And so it has to feel just right. Also, for me, the ergonomics is very important, and how you measure the opening of the package and how you put a torque on it, which gets to instrumental. I've done a lot of work on instrumental correlations, and that's great if you're measuring the same thing as the human. It's a watch out. And finally, sound. I recently just heard someone say, oh, I'm going to treat myself to a beverage, and I love the sound when I open the can. And I feel the same way about opening packaging. I happen to be, we're big wine drinkers in our house and wine aficionados. I love the packaging that's the twist top instead of the cork. It's actually better. But the sound that you get when you twist off a cap or a closure and you hear that it's tamper-proof because you can hear it, that is a critical sensory element. So finally, I think as a supplier, you have a tremendous opportunity to actually own and initiate how sensory is done for not only yourselves, for the industry, and for your customers, so that you are looking at what's happening through the different stages of development. And then you're also owning the process and the protocols for doing good sensory. So now I'll turn it over to someone who knows exactly how to do this for caps and closures, my good colleague, Tanya Fry. Take it away, Tanya.
All right. Gail, thank you so much. I love listening to you talk about sensory science. Your enthusiasm is just wonderful to hear, because sensory science is also my favorite topic to talk about also. So I'm glad to be here. I'm glad I was invited to get to talk about this, and let's get started. So, you know, at Dow Chemical, we are, of course, a resin manufacturer, but just want to point out that we go beyond that. We don't just sell our product. We have the wonderful capabilities to make, to fabricate those products. So we can do compounding and fabrication and physical testing and analytical testing. And of course, I'm here to talk about the sensory science aspect of it. So what do people think about the products? So overall, our standing objective for taste and odor testing is we want our packaging, our caps, to contribute as little or no off taste as possible to whatever food is packaged in it. So the purpose, and I've heard this from both John and Gail mention this a little bit. So we're, of course, doing product development. We want to continually improve our products. As Gail mentioned, it's probably been, for us as a Dow Chemical Company, we've been doing sensory analysis for about 30 years. And when we first started, it was more about, oh, look at our products, and they have these great physical properties. Oh, and it's got good taste and odor properties also. Well, now that is not an and anymore. It's a requirement, as I'm sure everyone in our audience is well aware of that. So we are always continuing to improve our products. And then we also look at optimizing process conditions, whether that's in the manufacturing of the product or the fabrication of the product. We know that how you fabricate your resins will affect or can affect the organoleptic properties. We know that how much time you're spending in the mold, what the temperature is, what the shear rates, all of those things play a part in your organoleptic properties. And then for our caps and closures market, we do lots of quality assurance work. We do not send out any products that have not already been tested for taste and odor properties, that it has to pass our test before we send it out the door and ship it out and sell it. And then, of course, we work with our customers for their requests and their development work through TS&D folks like John to improve the organoleptic properties. So these are some pictures of our Sensory Science studio. As I mentioned, we've been doing this for about 30 years, but this particular facility is only about 3 years old. We've moved to a new location, but as with our other one, it's an odor-free environment. You need to do your testing where it's odor-free, so all that you're smelling is your sample. So we have carbon filters on our air conditioning system. We have positive air pressure, so smells don't get trapped in the lab. We have sinks for our panelists and assessors as soon as they come in with fragrance-free soap. It's a quiet environment. It needs to be a non-distracting environment for them. It has neutral colors in the lab. We don't want to interfere with their thinking. In fact, we're using in-house employees, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So they are busy. We're in a very hectic environment. They're going from meeting to meeting. So we're trying to calm them down and have them focus on the task at hand. And then, of course, we have different lighting capabilities in the booths. We have 12 individual booths that panelists can sit at to do their evaluation. When the lab was built, it was very thoughtfully considered that you're not going to use any construction materials with odors. And then the sample preparation room is a completely different room. So you won't have any bias when panelists walk in or any kind of distractions or odors from that room. So then I wanted to throw in a slide here also about the sensory science knowledge. So there is a lot to it. I know that a lot of people think, well, in our case, you're just pushing a tray through a window. Anybody can taste and smell products. You know, just throw some numbers together and get us some information. But if you want reliable information to know what consumers are thinking, there's a lot of other things to it. So there's psychology. You know, sensory has its roots in psychology. You can see the picture here with the different lights in the booth. And Gail mentioned color, shades of color. So we are aware if our objective is to know how products taste, and if there's any kind of color difference between them, we're going to mask that color difference so that they can focus on just the tasting of it. Because people have a preconceived idea that if something is darker, if one sample is darker than the other one, then it must be stronger, or it must taste worse, or maybe they think it tastes better, you know, whatever their perception is. So we try to mask that. And then there's lots of science behind this. There's the biology, because we're using human beings. There's the chemistry of your caps and closures product. There's bacteriology, particularly in our new age of the COVID virus. We've gone through lots of changes to have a more clean environment than we even did, and space people out. Lots of considerations with that. And then also you have to have, you know, interpersonal skills. You want to encourage your panelists to, you know, make them feel comfortable, encourage them to continue to participate in evaluations. And then, of course, there's a lot of math and statistics involved, and then being able to interpret those numbers to correlate it back to your objectives. And Gail also mentioned different types of sensory testing with objective and subjective. Now, we don't do a lot of consumer testing. We typically would go to a company like Sensory Spectrum to do that. Our focus is really on the analytical aspect of it. You know, as a resin manufacturer, again, we want to ensure that our products are as good as possible for whatever food you might be putting into your packaging. So a lot of our tests are discrimination testing, and so that will help you determine if samples are different from each other, and then if they are different, you're going to want to understand what's different about them, which one is better, and why. So to qualify for the panel, so we do a lot of tours in our lab when we have new people join our organization, and the first thing they want to know is, well, how can I do this? What do I need to do? Sign me up. There's a lot of prestige in our company, I'll say, if you're on the panel. You get to say that you're one of the sensory panelists, because the qualification that we do, only about 25 to 30% of the population passes this test. So we're actually looking for the super tasters of the world for our analytical type work that we're doing. So to qualify, we're doing we're using the basic taste in water solutions at low concentration levels. And a lot of what we're doing is discrimination testing with the all familiar triangle test. So they would be presented 3 samples. 2 of them are identical to each other. 1 is different. They have to pick out which sample is different than the other 2. So we're seeing, can they distinguish differences? And then we go beyond that and we say, okay, after you have found which one you think is different, we want you to tell us what are the flavors of your samples. So they would have maybe 2 sweet and 1 salty, or 2 sour and 1 bitter. So they have to also describe the flavors of what is in those sample cups. And then if they do well on that, and those are at just should be recognizable detection levels for at least 50% of the population. If they get through that part, then there's the ranking. So then we even go to a lower concentration where we'll have 1 flavor. So let's say they're all sour flavors, but they're different concentration levels, and they're, of course, in a different order. And they have to taste them and then put them in order of ascending concentration. And then there's some odor recognition. So it's a stringent test, but the reason for that is because we want to know if things, when we do our testing, when things come through the lab, and if they pass our sensory panel, we feel confident that when it gets out to the consumer shelf, there's not going to be any issue from the polymer to that food product. And then once they are qualified and they pass the screening, then we need to calibrate our instrument. Our instruments are the people. So we do training, and it's specific for polyethylene products. And then we are fortunate to have such a large pool of people to recruit from. And so we have a large panel, and then each time we do an evaluation, we use at least 24 of those trained panelists. So then the panelists have their requirements also. They cannot eat or drink anything an hour before they come in so that they have a clean palate. That includes brushing your teeth. It's a non-distracting environment, as I mentioned, so there's no talking. They can't talk to each other. You know, they all know each other, so this has to be reminded. And of course, in the day of cell phones, everybody has it with them. They are not allowed to use their cell phone in the lab. They're not allowed to wear perfumes or colognes, but more than that, everything in today's society is scented. So every personal care product you have, so we ask them to buy the unscented product. And that also includes the detergent they use to wash their clothing in, because some of those can really linger. And we, of course, don't want that. They have to wash their hands with unscented soap when they come in. You have to make it convenient for your panelists to participate also. We have a 2-hour time slot that they know they can come in anytime during that time. And then it takes them about 5 or 10 minutes to do the test. And again, depending on your geography, this can change, depending on where you are. You have to know your panelists and what's convenient for them. We can do a panel session almost every day, but they don't want to be there for very long. So this, has to be considered. And then you have to motivate them, to get there in the first place and then to continue coming back. And so this also can change from one group of people to another. It's even different within our own company between our North American sensory group and our European sensory group. What motivates those people to participate? So sample preparation, I don't have a lot of details here. You just have to know your objective. So generally speaking about surface area to volume ratio, there's, the end use testing so that you have the same conditions and the same ratio as the actual application. Or in R&D where you're doing development, you may want to increase your polymer to volume ratio or use accelerated aging conditions to learn more about your products. So again, you just have to know what your objective is. And then the food media, what do you use? We, a lot of times, use water as our food media because it's neutral. We can focus on the packaging. That's our part of the story. So that is primarily what we're doing testing with. But particularly with caps and closures, we also need to understand the scalping effect that was mentioned previously. So you need to know your contribution effect and what flavors are being pulled out of your product, how it's changing. And then the conditions. We are fortunate to have the capability to fabricate the articles into an end-use application because that is going to also play a part in the organoleptic properties. We have the capability to ozonate water for like a bottled water application. And of course, we have ovens and UV chambers to simulate those conditions. So then also mention the scientific method. I still hear horror stories of people just walking down the hall, handing someone a couple of samples saying, hey, don't you think this smells worse than this? And people will take those samples and they'll go through the motions and they will then agree with you because you already told them the answer. So you want a completely unbiased answer when you're really wanting to collect data. So obviously we're following international standards. We have the qualified assessors. We have the specially designed lab. We're using scientific methods like balance block designs and 3-digit codes. When you present your samples, don't present them as 1, 2, and 3 or A, B, and C. You've already told them the order of that you expect. The larger number of assessors you have, the more reliable your data is going to be. Well, also depending on training, there's a balance to that. And then, of course, it has to be safe. So we have a human studies review board that ensures the safety, the FDA compliance of our products. And then in the end, you have to have your statistical analysis, not just, well, 51% of the people said this one was better, so that's what we're going with. Just please don't do that. Use real statistics to make your decisions. So in conclusion, to measure what consumers think, you really need your human input. And in sensory science, it can help you identify how packaging affects your taste and odor of your beverage or your food product. Helps you determine the difference between taste and odor characteristics in polyethylene. It can help you understand cultural differences or geography differences. Overall, it can really tell you, deliver customer solutions. And with that, I will pass it over to Shane and let him talk about the analytical part of testing our caps and closures products.
Thank you very much, Tanya, for the great introduction. We're going to talk about the instrument component at this time. Tanya and Gail gave a great introduction on the human component, but in developing and producing good quality resin in this area, you really have got to have the instruments to do the analysis. And we'll talk more in detail about that in just a moment. I do want to give you a little bit of background on this. There are actually 3 different types of interactions between the food package and the food and the environment. They're shown here on this slide: permeation, scalping, and migration. We're just going to focus in today on migration. In migration, the components in the package can migrate out into the food or the beverage. Now, those components could be residual components from the production of the polymer, such as residual monomers, residual comonomer, solvent. They can also be something that's added after the polymer is produced, such as additives. So the typical components are small molecules that migrate out. Now, most of these components do not impact the sensory, do not impact taste and odor. Now, I'm going to use taste and odor interchangeably here. In the polyethylene area, about or more than 80% of the taste components are volatiles. So we can do that in this type of presentation. If we think about those components, though, I mentioned that most of them don't give any taste or odor. Let's look at the 4 different areas in polyolefins that are important. You have your solvent, which is shown here, and really it does not contribute to the taste and odor. The odor threshold is high. It's in the part per million range. As you can see, for octane, it's 800 ppm. You can smell it if you stick your nose over a bottle of octane. You can smell it if you put your head into a headspace of a box of pellets. But after you fabricate the part, that material is gone, and the odor threshold is so high that it's not going to be detected by the consumer. The 3 other areas that are shown here in the blue box, those are the important areas to be looking at. The saturated carbonyls, those odor detection or threshold levels are at part per billion levels. As you can see here for octanol, 0.2 part per billion. And the unsaturated carbonyls, which could be either ketones or aldehydes, as an example here, this ketone is 15 part per trillion. And then finally, the phenols, which could be impurities in your additives, could contribute to the taste and odor, and some typical thresholds for those are in the part per trillion. Not all those components, again, have thresholds in this area, but those are some that are of area of concern. Now, if we look at this in more detail, we have the sensory technologies listed on this slide. The gold standard is the human sensory panel, and you can see the benefits and limit detections there and challenges. Now, our nose and tongue are amazing. Limit detections of part per billion, part per trillion. A lot of analytical instrumentation cannot reach those levels. The challenges, though, with the panel are shown here. there is the subjective side. You got to have good training, a large panel, but you also can have cultural differences. You can have differences between a panel in North America versus Europe versus the Asia Pacific area. You got to take those into consideration. Also, there's a limited number of samples that each panelist can evaluate every day. You can't present them with hundreds of samples a day. So that's where the instrumental side starts to come in. You really need something that can measure, that can provide data such as a pass-fail, and also can identify what is the cause for these differences. And we're going to talk more about those throughout this presentation. But you have the electronic nose there, which is a good substitute for a panel. It can give you a simple pass-fail. There are a lot of unknowns about the electronic nose, such as how do the metal oxide sensors respond? What are they responding to? Also, it requires models, and it doesn't tell you what molecule is causing these differences. Those last two technologies, though, are the bread and butter of analytical technology and identification of those components. You have solid phase microextraction, gas chromatography with an organoleptic detection port and a mass spectrometer in parallel. That is probably the most common technique used for measuring odor compounds. It has detection limits that are high. Again, you have somebody sniffing. You can have some subjective data there because of the differences that's reported during that sniffing experiment, and you can have a lot of interferences. Because, as I showed you, a lot of the components don't give you a taste and odor, but they're at typically higher concentrations than these taste and odor components. They're at part per million levels, while the odor components are at part per billion levels, so there can be a lot of interference there. And then finally, a new technology that's come out that is really a very exciting technology and helps significantly in this area is thermal extraction with GC-GC and a mass spectrometer. Great limit of detection, low part per billion area. Unfortunately, it is complex, and it's still challenging to correlate that data to an actual panel evaluation. If we look at the eNose in more detail, historically it's seen as a premier technology for quality control. Get a pass-fail from that analysis. It is very beneficial in fragrances, food, and beverages because you have high percentage levels of these components that it's measuring. It's also been applied in the food packaging area, but unfortunately it is very difficult to understand what it's actually measuring here, whether it's measuring the total volatiles or whether it's measuring the actual components in there. You also have to correlate that to a panel, and you've got to be able to generate good and bad samples or samples with differences that can be tested by the panel and identified by the panel, and then build your models on those. And a lot of plants don't want to waste time making bad samples because it's samples, it's resin that you can sell in the market. So it's very difficult to prepare those samples. You can't do it in the lab because the eNose is going to respond to any type of changes. And if you make it differently in the lab than a manufacturing plant, it will identify those changes. But there is some exciting news in this area, and that's the next generation of eNoses. We see introductions of portable eNoses. We're seeing improved metal oxide sensors that have been used in the traditional eNoses. But the third one that is really exciting is biosensor technology. They are synthesizing molecules that respond like the nose and the tongue. And we've seen very favorable results in this area. And those technologies are going to be commercially available in the next couple of years. So that's an area that you need to continue to watch. In terms of analysis and identification, we use chromatographic analysis. We can identify the structure using this technology. There's a couple of different approaches. I'm going to show you both of those in these next few slides. We have the separation of the volatile components using this technology, and then identification of those components using the organoleptic detector port. And you can see here a person, she's sniffing. She's got her Game Boy. When something comes out of the GC column, she pushes the button and identifies that, and she's got a microphone there. And she identifies that with terminology that is recorded on the chromatogram. With that data, we can then go back and look at the mass spectral data and hopefully identify those components. There's complex problems in this area, and most often it's not one single component that's giving the taste and odor, and that is a challenge because you have synergistic effects, you have effects when multiple components are combined together, and that makes it a challenge in correlating these components. But we're working on it, and we're making progress in this area. There are some major advances, and I do want to show you in the next slide. In the last 10 years, mass spectrometers have become more affordable, and they have provided better limit detections. You can now buy a benchtop time-of-flight mass spectrometer for a low amount of money, and combine that with high-resolution GC separation using GC-GC and get low part per billion concentration limited detections. And as an example, on this slide, we're showing you the separation using GC-GC. This is a contour plot. We're actually looking down on the peaks. And the top chromatogram is a virgin high-density polyethylene resin, and the bottom is a PCR flake. The colors here are shown in the scale at the bottom. The white is almost zero intensity, all the way up to red, which is high intensity. And high intensity is going to be part per million concentration levels on this scale. As you can see here in the virgin material, the odor active region has just a few components present. Those components are at low part per billion concentration range. This is a high quality material. Above that odor active region, though, is the hydrocarbons. And you can see those at many of those are at part per million concentration level. And this separation actually pulls apart those molecules so they can be identified much easier. Across the x-axis of this chromatogram, you have the first dimension, and then across the y-axis is the second dimension. You're actually taking one GC column, and every 2 seconds, the outlet of that column is re-injected onto a second column, and you're getting this separation. John mentioned PCRs. PCRs are a challenge in the sensory area, and this is a great example to show that. In this odor active region, there are hundreds of components. And as you can see, many of those are at part per billion concentration level based upon the scale. One that sticks out here is shown in the blue circle. That is at part per million concentration level, and that is limonene, very common to see in PCR flakes from high-density polyethylene. The area in yellow, which is a bit unusual, is probably from detergent, and the area in green there is an area that we typically don't see in resins, but these are phenolic compounds. And these are from degradation and weathering of the high-density PCR material. In summary, we have human sensory panel and analytical technology to help us in evaluating, developing, and monitoring the sensory quality of our resins. And the production of high-quality resins is challenging because of migration of components from these resins, and any changes in the process or the raw materials can make a big impact on the sensory properties. We do have analytical technologies that help us, and they help us to understand the differences that the human sensory panel is seeing. They help us to identify the root causes for these differences, and they enable development of high sensory quality resins. Thank you very much for allowing us to talk today, and thank you very much for joining us.